Thank you, and good morning to everyone. I think Alex has given us a very great start, so we are going to continue liming. I'm so excited to be part of this panel, to kind of look at just a second as I get my notes correct. So just to get started, my name is Clive Mutunga. I'm Family Planning and Environment Advisor in the Office of Population and Reproductive Health, which is in the Bureau for Global Health at USAID. In my role, I am the technical lead on the work that cuts across population dynamics broadly, but also looking at the intersection of family planning with the environment sector, and more broadly with the development sector. I'm also coordinate some of the field-based activities that look at the intersection of family planning in some of the community-based activities around the world, especially in areas where population pressures are endangering or a threat to endangered species or threatening biodiversity and other environmental pressures. So for this panel, which is the first one looking at scarcity or resilience, population, climate change, and resource dynamics in the Sahel, which are very powerful words looking at issue of population, climate change, which are seen as drivers to some of the challenges that we hear today. So with me today, I have a distinguished panel of four speakers who will broach some of the issues in the Sahel. Each of them will have about 12 to 15 minutes to present. They have the liberty to do a PowerPoint or just speak from their seat. And then at the end, we are going to open it up to a lively discussion, which we hope will kind of tease out some of the issues that will come out from the presentations. So we are going to get started with Roger Mark. Roger Mark doesn't need an introduction, but for those who might have missed, Roger Mark is the Director of Population, Environment, Security, and Resilience for the Woodrow Wilson Center. He leads programs on reproductive and maternal health, environmental security, and livelihoods, including the Center's Environmental Change and Security Program and the Maternal Health Initiative. I hope you have a sheet that has the bios or the detailed bio, so I won't go into reading the detailed bio. So Roger Mark will begin the conversation with an overview of the dynamics of the region with some focus on climate change, population, and resilience. And he did speak a deal of that, so we will give him a chance for the next 10, 15 minutes to add in additional thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clive, and thank you, Alex, for that excellent introduction and way to kick us off. And I would like to start with these images that you see here. These are images from Niger. I was there just at the beginning of the year on an initiative that was supported by Oasis, an attempt coming out of the University of California at Berkeley to promote leadership in the Sahel around family planning and food security. And we visited this project whereby these women were being taught different ways that they could help meet the food security needs of their community above and beyond. And this project had a very strong livelihood component. It was really focused on helping this community understand that investing in agricultural production was not only a good way to meet their nutrition needs, but it provided a way for them to meet their economic needs. And I was quite intrigued as I chatted with these women through an interpreter that many of them said to me exactly the same thing that Alex said in talking about the caravan. It was this idea of coming away with a full heart and full of hope in terms of where these communities are now in looking at these issues. So I'd like to build on that to talk a little bit on what it means to look at these dynamics for the Sahel and what it means for resilience. So as Alex has defined for you, resilience is the ability of people, households, communities, countries, systems to mitigate, adapt, and recover from shocks and stresses in a manner manner that reduces chronic vulnerability and facilitates inclusive growth. So this is a little bit of the framework that local actors in the region, donors, and those of us who are interested in the region are working with in the Sahel. We, as Alex has highlighted, we have a very clear sense of recurring zones of drought in the region. This is a persistent and chronic issue in the region that we know we constantly see in the headlines, and it's one that we are acutely aware of. And here you have an analysis of water requirements and satisfaction and what it means in terms of looking at drought conditions. Coupled with that, we know that there are generally recurring questions of food insecurity. So here you have an index that's looking at food security over the region, in the region, from 2012 to 2014. And as you see, this continues. We're well aware of this. But this is also accompanied by acute malnutrition throughout the region, a very, very important factor, sort of looking not just at the conditions around drought and food insecurity, but also really emphasizing malnutrition. And of course, we've talked a little bit about looking at questions around fertility and women's empowerment, but there are also questions around population movement within the Sahel. There are high levels of refugees that are projected to increase, and this is an area that we know those of us working in the region have to be aware of, because it provides links to other sectors that underline the fragility of certain communities and exacerbate conflicts. So it's very interesting to me that we look at this from a development perspective, and I wanted to have a sense of how the humanitarian community looks at the region. So I had a closer look at the humanitarian dashboard that the humanitarian community is using for the Sahel. And they look at the Sahel from a humanitarian perspective to have a sense of what are the key drivers. And they talk about these drivers in 4 general buckets around food security and malnutrition. So looking at those who are food insecure and what it means for their nutritional well-being. Conflict and insecurity, which we'll be talking about again later, but the importance that it means in terms of causing death, displacement, destruction of property, health facilities in schools, and how this serves as a factor that exacerbates current conditions, epidemics, which Alex referred to, poverty and lack of access to quality health services, and then natural disasters. So Alex talked about the increasing temperature rising in the region, but also what it means in terms of an erratic climate and recurrent disasters associated with things like droughts, floods, and animal pests such as locusts. So the humanitarian community looks at this in its dashboard and says, well, what are some of the key indicators that those of us working in the Sahel should be aware of? And these are the key planning figures that the humanitarian community is looking at. They say 24.7 million people are food insecure, 1.6 million are severely, acutely malnourished, children under 5 years, 4.8 million are moderately, acutely malnourished, looking at children under 5, 793,000 pregnant and lactating women, 3.3 million refugees, internally displaced, and returnees. So you not just have those who are displaced and those who are leaving, but this is usually an issue of last resort. What about those who are coming back? People are not voluntarily leaving their homeland. And then what is the response? What is the gap in the request for funding that helps us address these issues. So from a humanitarian perspective, looking at the region, these are some of the key indicators that they are using to make some of their determinations. So when I talk to my colleagues who look at the region from a perspective of drought and food security, they say, when you look at the food crisis and you sort of have a historical timeline, that this is really, you recognize the underlying causes of vulnerability, but the way that we as a development or humanitarian community respond, and a failure to adequately respond is actually underlying a resilience deficit, that we are not developing long-term structures and mechanisms that allow us to respond to the chronic conditions that we know exist in the region. So they say that the overarching driver of the 2012 Sahel crisis is not a food deficit per se caused by drought, but a resilience deficit. And we hear more and more policymakers in the region talking about this in this way. So Alex outlined for us some of the ways that donors such as USAID is beginning to get a handle on this. So there's a Sahel Joint Planning Cell that's working to coordinate humanitarian and development assistance and thinking about what this means in terms of USAID's comparative advantage in the region. There's a new initiative called the Sahel Resilience Learning Project, SREL, which some of you may have heard of. They're up and getting off the ground, but they're focusing on monitoring and evaluation of these efforts around resilience. How do we capture what we know? What are the main lessons? And how do we communicate these lessons in a way that we promote better understanding and application in the region? And they have a particular focus on gender in resilience building. So this is one initiative that is up and running in the region. Another initiative is the Resilience and Economic Growth in Sahel, Enhanced Resilience. So with a focus on poverty, looking at poverty among the poor households, livelihoods, what does it mean to increase off-farm income and increase vulnerable households' assets, natural resource management, how can we improve natural resource management practices and nutrition, how can we target the most vulnerable, those children under age 5. So there are other efforts. There's this resilience and economic growth in the Sahel, accelerated growth. This initiative, Regis AG, is looking specifically at the economic sector and tying it to food security with a focus on cowpea, small ruminants, and poultry. How can we improve market linkages? What does it mean for the development of agribusinesses in the region? How do we target economic and policy reform? And what are some of the financial services that can be provided that will help support microcredit and saving institutions? And finally, RISE, which we heard a little bit about from Alex, bringing together humanitarian and development funding that addresses these issues around humanitarian needs and development to build resilience and leveraging U.S. assistance in new ways. So coming out of the work of RISE, there's a Global Alliance for Resilience in the Sahel, AGIR, which came out of the Ouagadougou Partnership and Agreement that Alex talked about. So there's the Declaration on Population Development and Family Planning that Alex referred to, but the members of the Ouagadougou Conference helped launch the Global Alliance for Resilience for the Sahel and West Africa, helping to improve synergy, coherence, and effectiveness, building on the zero hunger target within the next 20 years. And interestingly, there's a regional roadmap that AGIR has developed, and the countries in the region are also defining national resilience priorities. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of activity. How do we try to keep all of this straight and have a sense of how are they coordinating with each other? This is really, really critical. I was chatting with one of my colleagues yesterday, and she was saying, well, where's our point of intervention? Where do we come in? Where do we get the most leverage? What are the points for interaction? And I hope this will come out in some of our discussions today. But I think when we look at some of the responses that we see to events that happen in the region, very often there's a missed opportunity. So this comes from my colleague Peter Kabus from Groundswell, who was looking at agricultural policies and the programs in the Sahel and linking them to resilience efforts. And Peter makes the point that very often the responses that we have in the agricultural sector are not long-term resilience and sustainability efforts. They do not address access to food by the poorer households. They're not examining barriers for women farmers. They're not explicitly focusing on nutrition, and they're not linking nutrition education with agricultural extension. So there's some really good interventions, but there are also some missed opportunities that we want to take note of and make sure that we're learning from and critically examining how we can be doing better. So this is from USAID's Sahel JPC strategic plan. But what I hope to convey here is that there's a sense of we need to get to a sub-national analysis of where chronic vulnerability lies. So here you are looking at women's participation and demand for change, and what does that mean in an agricultural sector? But as you look at the bar charts in the middle, it really is an attempt to deconstruct vulnerability and fragility at a household level and to get a sense of how we can target those households. So on the left, you have those who are chronically vulnerable, those who are vulnerable and who are reliant on assistance. They have low or no assets. Those who are vulnerable but viable, they have stabilizing assets. So those are the two categories that we see as being chronically vulnerable. Then you have those who are adapting and resilient. They're beginning to accumulate assets, and those who are entrepreneurial and thriving, who are leveraging their assets. So we must have a segmentation of fragility and vulnerability across some sort of continuum like this that allows us to target the chronically vulnerable to make sure that we're getting to those segments of the community. So I hope this provides a little bit of the framework that I think USAID and other donors are beginning to explore and examine. I like Alex, and I like the women farmers that I met, see that we are on the brink of a new window of opportunity. There is increased government interest in resilience, but I still think we need to further refine models for the Sahel. I do think that the model that's being implemented in the region is still the typical resilience model. I don't know that it is looking at drought as a chronic issue. It's still very much looking at shocks. But when you look at resilience planning in other parts of the world, a drought may be a shock, but for this region, it's chronic. It's a chronic condition. So we need to reframe our resilience paradigm for the region that really focuses on these chronic conditions that we know these countries are facing. The multi-sectoral approach that includes gender, population, nutrition, climate change adaptation, conflict management, and humanitarian response must come together. Those communities must come together in integrated ways. We must have multi-year secure financing to support these efforts, and we must continue to think of better strategies that meets the needs of the most vulnerable populations and households. So I hope that provides some overall general framing for you as we go into our discussions today. So thank you.
Thank you, Roger Mark. I like the way you started with full of heart, full of hope, borrowing from Alex, and moved on to look at the definition of resilience. I know Roger Mark provided the definition of resilience by USAID, but I know from your various disciplines, you might have various definitions for the word resilience. In fact, this morning I was thinking, as I was coming to work, what resilience is in Swahili, which I speak. I couldn't find a word, but I know in our own languages, in the various languages and definitions of the word, we know some of the things that come up very close, like the ability to cope, to recover, to balance back. And this is across individuals, families, communities, and systems. Roger Mark talked about the humanitarian dashboard, which was the first one for me, and looking at some of the key drivers and some of the figures from the people affected to the funding needs, and I hope we will be able to speak more about that. And of course, talking about the resilience deficit. And as you know, where there's a deficit, of course, there's a dividend. I was reading another article this morning from the Lancet talking about the resilience dividend coming from health system strengthening. And then he also looked at some of the USAID's resilience effort in the region, including rice, Sahel, Algiers, and then finalizing by looking at some of the missed opportunities, which were more on the agricultural policies, but I'm sure in your own disciplines you'll also find some of those opportunities. But the opportunities, he also looked at some of the windows of opportunity, and that's an excellent segue to our next speaker, who is Benoit Kalasa. Benoit Kalasa is presently the director for UNFPA Technical Division in New York. From 1st January 2013, he was the head of the UNFPA Regional Office for West and Central Africa, based in Dakar, Senegal, which is, of course, at the heart of this presentation. So, Benoit, you have about 12 to 15 minutes to talk about some of the issues around population pressures and how to reposition population dynamics among resilience programs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, colleagues and friends. Maybe just to add a little bit on my self-introduction. I'm just one month in New York. So when I was invited, I was wondering, should I go or not? But I have a special relation with the Sahel. In 1992, I was then in Paris and just completed my PhD, and then I was thinking of going back to teach. I'm originally from Congo, DRC. Then a group of friends approached me on a study that was starting, looking at the West Africa long-term perspective studies. And economists, demographers, so I joined that group. And that group actually pulled me outside the academic world, and then since then I joined the program. So the Sahel brought me to programming. What I intend to do in the coming couple of minutes is just start by introducing the population picture and the big trends that we see in the region. Both Alex and Mark, they presented the situation on the Sahel. We know the Sahel by drought. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to zero in on what I consider as a disconnect. Because even in the resilience deficit that Mark presented, when you look at the structural causes, you don't see population coming in as a structural cause for that vulnerability. So what we know about the Sahel is, of course, high fertility, and Niger now had the highest fertility, 3.7, almost annual population growth, almost 7 children per woman. But you come to Mali, it is the same. So despite all our interventions, USAID, UNFPA, all the donors, but we are not achieving what we are seeing now in Eastern Africa, in Southern Africa. So something is wrong, something is happening there that we do not understand, or we don't address the real theory of change. What we know also in that region is the movement of population. Probably because of the vulnerability, people had the tendency to move from the Sahel to the coast, going to Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Guinea before the crisis, Nigeria, or to migrate to Central Africa region. So the migration this is a region where all the population has been in a constant movement. And that's actually movement complicated the response to the Ebola crisis. What we have seen also in this region is urbanization. Because of that movement, most of the people, or they were built in the rural areas, people tended to go into cities on the coast, but also the few cities that we have in the Sahel countries concentrated the population. Dakar today concentrated the population. Mauritania, you have all the population. The Gambia, everybody is in Banjul. So that is also one major trend that we see coming in the region. So urbanization will remain a major trend in the region. But this is changing. Of course, 10 years ago, when you go to N'Djamena, the first thing that you will see was those black plastic bags everywhere. But I went back to N'Djamena last year, and things are changing. N'Djamena is becoming a clean city. So as we think or we speak about this city, let's also think about the positive things that are happening also. I think many positive things are changing. So urbanization growth is still high, and I think West Africa is becoming not much a rural area zone, but more and more an urbanized region. And we need to think about what will be the coping mechanism of those people living in the cities, because are we moving poverty from the rural areas to the cities, or how do we ensure that that resilience we are planning to build is also close the residential settings. This is a classic age structure of most of those countries, and that age structure has the momentum that determine the future of the population. Whatever we do now is already building in that age structure. So it will take time before the ship can stop. So this is just a few slides that I put with some scenario just to show that if you keep the hypothesis as it is today, so you take 6 to 7 countries, the population will move from 80 million to almost 400 million. But if we embark into Alex's recommendation that we implement the costed family planning plans of those countries, maybe we might come down to less than 300 million. That is a huge difference between above 400 million and less than 300 million. But still, when in the discussion of demographic dividends, we do not have the right structure that will allow countries, even the scenario 2, to have the necessary age structure that will bring in that needed active population to respond or to be the engine of economic growth in those countries. 1995 and 2015. This is the conclusion that we reached in 1995 with the West African Long-Term Perspective Study. And if you look at those conclusions, they're still the same. So you think yourself that this region is not moving. So that is what I called here linking the dots or addressing the disconnect between the root causes. Following the crisis Mali, the United Nations thought about coming about some coordination. The first strategy that was called Integrated Strategy for the Sahel had only two pillars because we needed to respond to the crisis in Mali. The first response was peace and security. Then some other players came and said, look, why only peace and security? Why don't you look also at the governance? So they added the governance structure. But in 2013, some of us joined the team and said, no, we cannot only speak about peace and the governance. What about the people? So a third pillar, resilience. I don't know which definition I will speak about here. Is it the USID resilience? But at least we needed to address some of the key drivers of vulnerability. And one component that I fought for was the last one. How do we include the population dynamics as part of building resilience? For me, I'm really convinced that addressing sexual and reproductive rights, empowering girls and women, builds individual communities' resilience, including fighting gender-based violence. Unless you address that, you cannot build long-term solutions. So you're still addressing short-term, and then if you address short-term solutions, then it is over today, but in 3 years, you restart again. So going forward, I think that we need to integrate that pillar and be very clear in our mind that this should be part of all the solutions that we are proposing. So the Ouagadougou initiatives is one of that responses that I believe that should be considered as a key pillar, because we have that group of countries that embrace that. But beyond that, the story that is not told was that most of those countries are French-speaking countries. And there is a type of policy where everything was led to France, but France did not have a strong reproductive policy like the UK or the US. So to see that the Ouagadougou partnership brought together the French government and other players, I think that brought some new dynamics in implementation of the family planning programs in those countries. And I believe that is value added to the intervention. The Sahel Women Empowerment Program. This I consider myself as one of my success in the 2 years I stay in the region. When my executive director asked me to leave Dakar and to come to New York, I told him, but boss, I just succeeded to conclude this partnership with the bank. Let me, at least now that we start implementing, be part of the story. He said, no, you just come. So, so I had to move. But what is at the heart of this program is that while the Ouagadougou partnership is working on the second pillar, which is the supply, but the demand side is still needed to be addressed. What I mean here is that not only the unmet needs for family planning, but ensuring that the girls, they are well educated, they stay in school, that the women, they have the means to be economically, financially independent. Unless you do that, then they can be in the position to claim the rights for information and for services. So that is a key level for access to quality family planning. So if there is no education, if there is no economic empowerment of girls and women, the demand will not be there. So you ensure that, then you go to the next pillar, which is now the traditional supply of commodities, of sexual reproductive commodities. And then you need to build the policy dialogue around it. And that is something we need. So this framework is actually the needed framework for demographic dividends. So if you do that, then you can ensure that you are investing. You look at family planning, at girls and women empowerment as key strategies for building the human capital for all the claims that we have in the region, Afrique emergent or country emergent, whatever. But unless we do that, we need to have the right human capital. So the challenges are still the same. So we need to continue addressing urbanization. We need to ensure that the livelihood is, we need to ensure that there is that multi-sectorial approach between the various implementing partners. There is a coordinating mechanism, Ouagadougou Partnership, AP 2020, the UN system. We need to be still mindful of the security situation. West and Central Africa is still a very a region with a lot of uncertainty, from Central Africa to Mauritania. But if you go beyond, if you continue the map that Mark showed at the beginning, it goes to Djibouti, it goes to Somalia. So that is the Sahel band that we are talking about. I think I'm almost done. There are a lot of opportunities. The opportunities is how do we unpack today and program for the demographic dividend framework? How do we look at education, most of our programs, not as health programs, but as development programs, and make the various partners to buy in? How do we leverage the financial resources that are going to the region now and make sure that as we move to the Sustainable Development Goals, they reach the people, they reach everyone, that human rights, universal access, and we have the data to account for. And let's take the momentum of the political will today. For the first time now, you have political leaders, president of head of state from Chad, Niger, standing up and speaking about things that they could not speak about a few years ago. So I think if we seize the moment, I'm sure we can start seeing a different future we want for the region and for the Sahel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benoit. And thank you for letting us know about your mobility from what you call Sahel bringing you to the programming world, and the most recent move from Senegal after the Sahel Women Empowerment and Demographic Dividend and kicked off, but you had to come to New York. I feel that Benoit was able to really hone in some of the key population dynamics, trying to show out the disconnect, some of the disconnects and how to connect some of the dots, talking more specifically on the size of the population in the region, the growth, mobility, and the structure of the population, and of course, honing a lot on urbanization, which is a big challenge for the region. But not also, the challenge is also going into some of the innovative approaches like the UN Integrated Strategy for the Sahel, which talks about governance, security, and resilience, and also identifying some of the challenges and opportunities, including demographic dividend and some of the financial resources and the sustainable development goals. So thank you for that. So we are going to move to the next speaker, and our next speaker is Sylvia Kabus. When I asked Sylvia, how can I pronounce your last name, she told me it's Carbon Bus, and she's from the Philippines.
My husband's last name is much more complicated.
Yes. So, Sylvia is the Gender Advisor for the Bureau of Food Security at USAID. and also for the Feed the Future initiative. She has previously worked in a number of implementing work in a number of countries across the world, and she's going to give an overview of key gender issues, social norms, in addition to demographics, with a focus in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, and trying to kind of show how the gender issues and social norms cut across the communities and how those are likely to be addressed in programming. So, Sylvia, please take the podium for the next 10 to 15 minutes.
I like to sit.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, no PowerPoint. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on the Sahel. I like to say in the Bureau of Food Security, we help farmers and their husbands. So I am also a little of an outlier because I'm not in the Bureau of Global Health, but we work very closely with our friends in Global Health and across other bureaus. But before I start, I'd like to remind Roger Mark that limes are very tart, so I hope we have a very lively discussion today. The Sahel is a region that's very dear to my heart. We spent 2 years in Mali and 2 years in Burkina. My husband is Berber, so he's a Tuareg cousin, and my mother-in-law was married at the age of 10. So many of the issues that we're going to talk about today in the context of gender are very personal and very close. The Sahel is a very lucky region in the sense that it's been studied and overstudied over decades now. So there's a huge knowledge base that we operate from. So many of the quick facts that I'm sharing, I'm sure, are familiar to the audience. We know that although we have very many variations across communities and across borders, that generally speaking, in the Sahel, we have a very patriarchal culture where women and girls have low status, and their status is determined in relation to men and their marital status, and sometimes even their fertility status. And we know that there is very limited decision-making by women on the household level and family planning issues, as well as other key domains. We have many social economic barriers to full participation and empowerment, including polygamy, early marriage, gender-based violence, and an overall lack of access to basic health and education services. As Mr. Benoit has already mentioned, there are a number of important demographic factors. And in addition to the high birth rates, we also have a high rate of male out-migration, which I'll discuss a little further on. But at the same time, we do have a lot of opportunities in that women are the traditional guardians of health and nutrition status on the household level. So how do we reinforce that to improve the overall status of the household? And they also play a prominent role in ag production and food security. One figure from Burkina Faso is that 36% of ag production is done by women. However, we're operating in a context of scarcity and insecurity. Even in normal times, these communities are living on the edge. And the Sahel experiences, as we've already seen, shocks on a regular and recurrent basis, most recently in 2012 with the food crisis. And there's also regional instability, such as the recent influx of Malians into Burkina and Niger and other neighboring countries because of the political situation in Mali. So the traditional coping mechanisms that we've seen have become either inadequate or overall exhausted. We know that ag production is highly gendered. Men and women work in different crops and different value chains. And even in the same value chains, such as millet, they have different roles. And in the same way, coping mechanisms are highly gendered. Men and women, girls and boys, respond differently to different kinds of shock. We do see that women bear the brunt in terms of the coping mechanisms that are employed at the community level. The first reflex is to sell household assets. And many of those assets traditionally belong to women, such as small ruminants, kitchen utensils, jewelry. So those are the first to go. Women are also in a position to exploit social and kinship ties as a response, either borrowing money or food from relatives and neighbors, or because this region has a long tradition of women's savings groups called tontines. That's another resource that women are able to tap into. Because women generally have low status and they often eat least and last, reducing food intake is also a coping mechanism that we've seen. And taking children out of school, saving on school fees. We already know that girls' education has a tenuous status in the region, so it's very easy to take girls out of school, especially when the parents don't see the eventual benefit of this investment. Male outmigration is something that we see on a regular basis, either to provincial or national capitals, or even to other countries such as Cote d'Ivoire. And even if they do migrate, the flow of remittances is often irregular or non-existent. In one sense, this is an opportunity because women become de facto heads of households, but in another way, they're managing their households without the same resources and rights as men would have. And we've also seen an increase in forms of prostitution, transactional sex. We've heard anecdotal evidence of women who have sex for a bar of soap or for half a kilo of millet. We also see that rates of early marriage increase. And this is a particularly interesting phenomenon because early marriage is not only a way to reduce your household size so you have one less person to feed, but it's also an injection of assets because the dowry is often pretty substantial, such as 1 or 2 head of cattle. And we do see in the most recent crisis that coping mechanisms have diversified. And again, this is tied into women's status as the guardians of health and nutrition. We see women setting aside larger portions of their harvest for the hungry season. We see more engagement in petit commerce, so more selling of small items so that there is a cash infusion of some sort to buy food, particularly food that's not locally grown. And we also see somewhat consumption of seeds. Women are often the managers of seeds, and we've seen that sometimes those are consumed as cereal instead of being saved for the next planting season. So with all these challenges, what are some of the things that we can do? In the Sahel programming that for USAID that Roger Mark has reviewed, we're trying to hit these issues from a number of different angles. The first is diversifying economic opportunities, not only reinforcing traditional activities such as petit commerce, but also helping women branch out into non-traditional livelihoods such as moringa. One group that we visited in Burkina Faso, which luckily was only a couple of hours from Ouaga, actually grew parsley in their kitchen gardens because they found that there was a real market niche with the restaurants and the Lebanese community in Ouaga for parsley. We want to promote women-friendly, climate-smart practices because we know that women do the majority of the work oftentimes. And land tenure is also an important issue, not only advocating for land tenure reform, but also reinforcing the tradition of granting women's groups access to land that's community owned. So we want to make sure that that land is quality land and that women have long-term rights to it. We're also trying to promote behavior change programs for health, nutrition, and family planning, WASH, MCH, and the other priorities in the health sector. And we also want to make sure that women can even have the ability to go to the activities that we plan. And that can mean something as simple as organizing community-based trainings instead of trainings in the capital, and providing an extra hotel stipend so that the babysitter can come with the small child when women go to trainings. And because we've evolved from the women in development approach to the gender in development approach, we are really strongly committed to constructive male engagement. And one of the promising practices that we've seen in the Sahel is the École de Marie that UNFPA Niger has piloted and that we're now replicating in Burkina and in Niger, where men are organized in groups and they talk about important issues such as family planning and how to be a responsible father and what are the qualities of a good husband. And some of the changes that we are talking about are so simple and so basic, such as when we register families for activities, changing the title from head of household, who is usually male, to representative of the family. I mean, you're just changing the label, and yet you're opening up the door to much wider participation of women. And another important point that I like to convey too is sometimes it's important to ask the right questions. In a recent visit to Mali, I was talking to a group of women and asking them about the improved variety of millet that the village had just received the previous year. So they'd already gone through one planting and harvesting season. And I asked them, so what do you not like about this millet? Well, they said, it takes too long to cook. And that immediately set off bells for me, because if it takes too long to cook, that means that it takes more water and more firewood. So that has climate change implications because, of course, those are natural resources, and also safety and security implications because it's normally women and girls who search for these resources, and when they're displacing themselves, they're often in a more vulnerable context. And lastly, I'd like to mention our Women's Empowerment in Ag Index, which many of you are familiar with. And in our resilience program, we are taking two of those domains in production and resources, measuring input in productive decisions and access to and decisions on credit. So that hits another of the couple of themes that my colleagues have discussed today. So I'd like to close by saying that we are building upon 30 or more years of investment and experience in the Sahel. And that experience leads to a lot of innovation, and it really is an exciting time to work in the region. And I look forward to today's discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sylvia, and for sharing your work in helping farmers and their husbands. I think I like that remark. And Sylvia was able to share some of the quick facts around gender in the region, and more interesting also to look at some of the coping mechanisms which are gendered, and these include taking children out of school, male out-migration, transactional sex, early marriage in some of the cases reported. And we saw how some of these coping mechanisms have also diversified. But Sylvia also talked about some of the innovative ways in the Sahel programming, for instance, diversification of economic opportunities for men and women, women engaging in climate-friendly smart agriculture, but also addressing some of the systemic issues like land tenure and property rights, and some exciting work on behavior change programming in water sanitation and hygiene, family planning, MCH, and other health activities. Then Sylvia concluded by talking about gender and development and how some of things like asking the right questions make a big difference. And thank you so much, Sylvia. So we go to the last presenter. Our last presenter is Michael Van Meen, who works for Maria Stopes International. She's a program management and sexual and reproductive health expert with more than 10 years of experience managing international health programs in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. So Mike will talk about how to demystify family planning. Each of the speakers have talked about family planning in one way, but it's family planning with other sectors. We're talking about family planning with gender, with climate, with environment. But also, we need to hear the perspective on the ground on how really to make the dots happen on the ground. And Mike is here to take us there to some of the field-based programs. Welcome.
Thank you, Clive. Yes, indeed. Talking about family planning, or demystifying family planning, as we called it last week on some prep call. So talking about resilience in the Sahel and listening to everybody, all the speakers before me, it can be quite daunting, actually, looking and hearing it, thinking, oh my word, where to start? And having lived just come back actually from living 4.5 years in Senegal, and I lived in Chad a long time ago. I think one of the most amazing things about the Sahel is actually the resilience of the people. So my PowerPoint is all about people. No words, but just images. Because they are extremely resilient and make the best of the harsh conditions where they live. And if we can take that resilience and make it bigger and make it into these big topics that we're talking about today, I think that would be a really awesome start. So I am honing down on one small issue, just the issue of providing contraception to women. But I think it is the issue that starts and ends it all for the Sahel. Without that, where do we go? So we've seen that around the world that providing family planning can dramatically change the family sizes and the desired family sizes. And we've seen that in so many places, in Bangladesh, in Iran, in Morocco, in Rwanda, I don't know, just a lot of places. But in the Sahel, what I hear and what I heard a lot in Senegal, not possible in the Sahel, can't provide family planning in the Sahel, can't do that because, I don't know, you name it, too much societal taboo, there's too much, the religion won't allow it, the husbands won't allow it, women don't know about it, the women want a lot of children. There's tons and tons of reasons that get thrown at Stopes International for when you want to start up a program, in my case in Senegal, to say, can't do it, it's impossible. And I think we've been talking like that for such a long time that we've actually started to believe it ourselves. But Stopes International is an organization that's provided 18 million women with family planning method last year. So I think, we know how to go around or work with those challenges. Sometimes go around them, yes. So, we've dealt with the angry husband a lot. But we've also dealt even more with the woman who will come despite her angry husband. We've worked a lot with the imams in the Sahel, but we've also, again, worked a lot with, and even more, with women who don't ask their imam. So in all these discussions, I feel and I fear sometimes that we don't actually listen to the woman enough about what she wants, and by listening to her, we can see that it actually isn't impossible to provide these services to all these women that you see passing by on the screen. And there are many millions of women, as Benoit mentioned, that have an unmet need for family planning, that want to access these services, but do not for many reasons. And we can change that if we have the right resources, and if we put enough effort, resources, technical resources, financial resources, and political will. Alex was mentioning it earlier today. The one country that has done this in the Sahel in the last couple of years is Senegal, actually. And Senegal has seen an amazing increase in its contraceptive prevalence rate. So if it can happen in Senegal, I'm pretty convinced it can happen everywhere else. But we need to stop saying, we also need to stop saying that it's not possible. And not only that, we need to recognize that without providing choice to women, right? We're not asking, or we're not saying to do anything revolutionary. We are just saying, let's provide these women with a choice that they want to make, so that they can control their fertility. We can. If we don't do that, then how are we gonna develop this region, really? I mean, if you look at the numbers, which we've seen some of the quite scary graphs coming by. If we look at the numbers, if we look at just I was just calculating the countries where Marie Stopes is present, which is actually Mali, Senegal, and Burkina Faso, and we just started in Niger. Today there's about 67 million people there, and by 2030 it will be 99 million, 2050 it will be 158 million. How are we going to educate all of those, or how are they going to get access to education, or food, or anything for that matter, jobs, economic security? How is that going to happen? If you look at it like that, for me, in any case, it makes it big and scary and daunting. But if we bring it back down to the individual woman who is perfectly capable, if we give her access to make a choice that is right for her family, for the community that she lives in, if we bring it back down to that level, we can actually really make a substantial change and really start addressing this issue of population growth in the region. So the thing is, I think, with family planning, that it's a little bit scary to talk about it, unless you're a Marie Stopes and it's all you talk about. But if we're not in this world, if we talk about security or food security or climate change, or talking about family planning becomes very difficult because it touches upon something that nobody really wants to talk about: sex, and women's empowerment, also an issue. So two issues that people don't want to talk about. So it's easier to say it's not possible because of all these societal taboos. So I would say today, challenge ourselves to stop being scared of the topic, stop saying that it's not possible because actually we're seeing that it is, and also just recognizing it as such a fundamental part of making this for the future of this region. And really, if we don't address it, then all other efforts around everything that we try to do risk failure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for narrating the story, the powerful story of women through the beautiful photos, and telling us about some of the work MSI is doing to really promote uptake of voluntary family planning, and some of the strategies like taking a cross-sectoral approach, like talking to women who are coming to the imams and those who are not listening to the imams, and the hungry husband and the one who is not hungry, and of course making the case for listening to the woman, because pretty much some of the times we are not doing that, and trying to also sketch issues around resources and political will, and challenging ourselves really to make service, to make commitment with the women. So thank you for that. I think that brings us to the end of the presentations from the panelists, and this is a good time now to have some discussion. And before I open it to the floor, I probably want to, because I have the mic at the moment, just to ask one question to all of you. We are talking about some integrated approaches, and trying to show how we need commitment for multi-sectoral work that cuts across various sectors. And here we are in Washington, and I am wondering if what you see as opportunities or challenges, if you were speaking to the policymaker in Bamako or in Ouagadougou or in Niamey. I'm challenging myself, Mike, but I would want to believe you might be confronted with a situation where someone will say that is, if you're talking about gender, talk to the Minister of Gender and Development. If it's family planning or population, talk to the Minister of Population and National Development. Food security is a Minister of Agriculture and Livestock in all these countries. So how do you get the various policymakers to really recognize the importance of multi-sectoral approaches that integrate population and family planning as a key to sustainable development across the various sectors? And any of you can go first. Okay. Benoit, please.
Thank you. I think I can answer to this, and that is why I did say that the current project that we start with the bank in the Sahel is really multisectoral. When you take the first pillar that I mentioned, girls and women empowerment, we have the Minister of Education, the Minister of Youth, the Minister of Action Sociale, I don't know, dealing with humanitarian, something like that. Then in the second pillar, you have the Minister of Health, of course, then the Gender Ministry in the first pillar, and in the last pillar, you usually have the Finance Ministry. And the beauty is that this being led by the bank, the entry point has been the Finance Ministry. Then you have a different ministry as a coordinating. So when we did have the first meeting for the 6 countries, some countries were sending up to 5 different ministers coming together and talking about development. I think you are right. It is challenging to speak about this issue because development is mostly in silo, and we do work in silo. But for me, I feel already integrated because I do work with Maristop, I do work with USAID, and you name it. So many agencies that we do work with. So it is a very complicated issue, even for development partners. I want to be seen as UNFPA and being recognized as UNFPA. And then going to see my colleague, the regional director for USAID in Ghana, to say, let's sit together, talk about Algeria. It is difficult, but that accountability and whatever, that's something that we need to address, not only from the government side, but as development partners, also to be mindful that we need also to be integrated.
Thank you. Any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. So I hear you asking 2 things, Clive. The first thing is, how do we make these arguments across different ministries and sectors so that they understand, right? I think that's part of what Benoit is talking about. And I think the second part of your question is, how do we move and inform policy? Right? So I think that there's sort of two prongs for me in thinking about how we do that. So I think we need to provide evidence from one sector that shows, if it's not a multi-sectoral investment, that there is a loss of investment. And we have to have documentation that provides that. And I think capturing those stories of success where it has worked and really documenting the risks involved that demonstrate that you need a multi-sectoral strategy in order to develop resilience to these chronic conditions is important. I think the second dimension of your question is, how do you go in and inform policy? It's how do you develop capacity building for advocates on the ground so that they're able to push and inform policy? How do you get an informed media and journalists who can report in a very sophisticated way on these issues within those countries, but I would also argue within the United States? You know, very often those policymakers are paying attention to what the foreign press has to say about the issues in their countries. So they're important levers. How do we capture the stories of success? Just last week, we did a briefing for congressional staff here at the Wilson Center who were interested in learning about Africa. And one of the things that we shared with them is that ultimately you have to have a sense that it's not just one continent, that there are various stories within the continent, and how do we capture that at a subnational level and inform U.S. policymakers also. So I think it's a multi-pronged strategy that leverages media, developing the capacity on the ground, capturing success stories in compelling ways, and learning what Africans want to learn from other regions. I think we were looking at the demographic dividend. I think for a lot of African policymakers, they want to learn from Asian tigers and what has worked and what has not worked. So how do we capture these stories and present it in policy-relevant, compelling ways that they see the utility of it and are willing to take it up?
Thank you.
Yep. When I've been on TDYs, and we always try to visit with our host government partners. There are a number of different entry points that we've identified that we can encourage this type of discussion, or even to promote the partners' convening power, convening authority. For example, in Burkina Faso, the Ministry of Women's Affairs actually has a unit in each of the line ministries. So we met with this gender unit in the Ministry of Agriculture, and we talked about how they coordinate with the Ministry of Health on nutrition and family planning, as well as providing the technical resources to women farmers. Many of the countries in Africa where we work are signatories to international agreements such as CEDAW, CAADP, the Consolidated African Agricultural Development Plan, African Union commitments. 2015 is the year of women's empowerment, so that's one friendly reminder that we often try to convey. And lastly, we want to support the countries that have gone beyond these commitments. For example, the Ministry of Agriculture in Rwanda has a gender strategy, and it includes coordinating with other ministries on these important cross-sectoral issues. So our challenge there is, how do we, as AID mission and partners, how do we support the implementation of that strategy?
Thank you. So let's open up, and when you get the mic, please introduce yourself, and if it's a specific question or comment to any of the panelists, please make it so. Let's take the first four. 1, 2, 3, 4 for the first round.
Robert Schroeder with International Investor. First, I'm very thankful that you all came and that you're educating some of us about the connection of population growth to all the development and sustainability goals. We've wondered about that for quite some time. But my specific questions would be, Ms. Van Min, you mentioned your efforts in Senegal. Are there any ways to measure whether it's making a difference or not? Are we seeing the birth rates decline as of yet? Coming from an economic perspective, we're always looking for numbers. And even to educate the media, that's going to be part of the process. So Sylvia, I'd also ask you, picking up on Mr. Mark D'Souza's comments, is it important for not just USAID, but multilateral institutions, et cetera, to take up this cause again in a more meaningful way? In other words, coming out with statements about population growth and how they are sometimes counterproductive as far as other sustainability goals are concerned? Do we need institutions to be bold enough to take a stance on this, a public stance? And finally, I'd really be curious to know, Mr. Colasso, whether, we heard a comment about how these population problems can add to human trafficking problems, prostitution. Do you see any connection between urbanization and those problems? And that's it for me. Thanks.
Number 2.
Good morning. I'm Sandy Olexio Gikutu with USAID in the Africa Bureau in Education. I wanted to make an observation, a comment. I'm here for the day. I think the agenda is very informative, and I'm going to bring my own bias to my first comment. Much of what I hear being said, the idea of how do the Asian tigers work, how do we mitigate population growth, and how do we mitigate health challenges, how can we give skills for, in effect, self-learning so that individuals can be more independent as they hear information, and this part is dealing with countering violent extremism, so they can determine better how they form their opinions on something. Where I'm going, of course, is the fact that education is part of all of this. Mm-hmm. It brings much to the dialogue. It provides the forum for mothers' clubs with young girls. Mm-hmm. One of the things often in the work we do in Africa, I hate saying some of this stuff, but it's the way we do our business, we often tell families you increase your bride price and your value by having an educated woman who brings something to the family, who mm-hmm. can look after finances and health care in ways that she wouldn't if she didn't have these skills. So I just want to be a bit of a gadfly and say that there's no one in education all day long addressing those kinds of opportunities and how they support everything you're talking about. Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Barbara Gong. I'm a PhD student studying anthropology at the University of Witwatersrand. I just wanted to point out a couple of observations. My first over is to say that when we are talking about the Sahel, other than the national boundaries that were created during the colonial period, there's really nothing to say on the linguistic, cultural, and all other aspects that really bind together this community or this region. So I just want to know how you are considering that, because if you look at it, it appears like it's really a series of countries and not just one place. Then the other thing I wanted to take up is to Mr. Benoit. It has to do with reproductive rights. And you mentioned a little bit about, girls and reproductive rights. Now, your take is that, when girls are educated and women are educated, they are going actually, to up their act on their reproductive rights. But I take it and look at it from the perspective of the United States, which is, which is the face of, women having all the rights on all levels you could possibly think about. They're educated, all ducks are in a row, and so on and so forth, but they're still grappling with the issue of reproductive rights. Today in the US, they're still struggling, with abortion. So what do you have to say about that? And my consideration is that I do not think that just having education is going to be a magic bullet where women's reproductive rights are going to be addressed.
What's the last one for the first round, and then we'll take another series of questions.
Hello, thank you all for being here today and for your wonderful presentations. My name is Catherine Kinnaird. I'm with the Moroccan American Center. And I just wanted to ask how US allies in North Africa, like Morocco and Algeria and other countries, can take part in some of the development initiatives in the Sahel.
Thank you. So if I could recap the questions, the first one from Robert is to Mike, and it's about measurement of impact of the programming in Sahel. Then to Sylvia, whether there's need to make more additional public statements in support of the issues, and to Benoit, talking about urbanization and how it relates to some of the issues that we have talked about, like prostitution and transactional sex. And then Sandy, I think US is more of a comment, but any of you can feel free to talk about the importance of education for the issues that we are talking about. In my personal opinion, I think education, most of the speakers have touched how education, especially female education, is very critical, not only for, it's a very central part of building resilience, because some of the challenges that we are seeing are because of girls who are getting married off at age 13 and 14 and having to drop out of school and not so if women were able to stay in school for longer, of course, the issues that we are talking about would be not at the level that we are talking of right now. Then Barbara talks about, requested to hear how talking about specific countries as opposed to Sahel as a region could maybe inform the discussion. And also to Benoit specifically on reproductive rights, commenting on reproductive rights. And then Catherine talks about the potential role of US allies in North Africa and Morocco to push the agenda forward. So do you want to get started, Mikey? Then come this way.
Sure. I'll start with the impact question. Yes, I think there has been significant impact in Senegal, but also in Mali and Burkina on the provision of family planning. We can measure that by the fact that we know that we've served over 750,000 women with a family planning method. In Senegal, the CPR has increased dramatically over the last 3-4 years, which is partly due to, I would say completely due to the arrival of Marie Stopes, but probably more partially due to the arrival of Marie Stopes. But significantly, the market share of what what Marie Stopes is doing in country is about 50% of all long-term methods are delivered through channels that Marie Stopes do, which is basically outreach teams that go to far and remote areas. Has there been a decline in fertility? I think it's too early to tell. I think hopefully it will lead to that. Senegal has a continuous DHS, so we can continue to watch that very closely. In Mali and Burkina, it's a little bit more difficult to see the overall impact. But I know that our programs in Mali, about 45% of all family planning methods delivered in Mali are through Marie Stopes International. That is also very worrying, because it also really means that the market, that people who are acting in the market are very small. There's very few actors. So it goes to my previous point that it's not impossible. If we make it available, women will come, but there's many more actors needed, including the government, but also including others. Maybe just to point some of the other questions. Education, yes, I think education is left, right, and center of everything that needs to be done. For the work on family planning, education is part of the service delivery. You can't do one without the other. And also around the point of demand generation, you need to inform communities and individuals about what's going on, and that needs to be more officialized if we want to have a bigger impact nationally. The Sahel as a region, I think there are many overlapping factors and cohesive factors across the different countries. They have similar religions, they have similar society. Like Senegal and Mali they're the same almost. So Senegal and Mali are very much intertwined and culturally very very close. Which is also, and then in Burkina and in Chad and Mauritania, it's not all the same, but there are so many overlapping factors that I think make looking at this region makes a lot of sense. And I think the leadership that is shown in Senegal on the issues of family planning can be taken across the region. They look at each other, they talk to each other, they have a competition amongst each other, and that goes to the Morocco point as well. I think Morocco and possibly other Northern African countries, but Morocco especially has a huge role to play in this. They've in a very short space of time have increased their contraceptive prevalence rate significantly to like 67% or something, as European countries have. They're obviously it's a Muslim majority country. So I think there are a lot of, somebody else was mentioning it about learning amongst other countries. I think there's a lot of scope to get Morocco more involved in demystifying family planning and the Islam in this specific case, because if it can be done in Morocco, then the argument that you can't do it in Mali becomes a lot more difficult to uphold.
Thank you. Benoit?
Very quickly, is there any direct link between urbanization and human trafficking? I would not say that, but the type of settings that we are finding in many of the cities, if you have the slums, then I think the risk increases of seeing some young people, including unemployment. And we do have that movement of, for West Africa, we have the type of enfants confiés, those from the rural areas going to the cities. That might also increase that risk of human trafficking. But saying that there is a direct link, I don't think so. But there is an area that is being looked at right now of investment, that is the civil registration and vital statistics. I think that with that, it might bring some order in terms of knowing the movement of who is where, and at least the record of population. And our conversation today we are talking about parenthood, where people have that responsibility. The more the people have the choice of when and how many children they can have, then we minimize that risk of seeing children moving around and then out of control. I think that is also something we need to bear in mind. Human capital education is the art of that construction we are talking here. I think we cannot leave out education. And the type of education we need now when it comes to demographic dividend, I think it is about the skills, employability, not only sending people to school, but just building that capability. I think that is all about the resilience we are discussing. Teaching people to adapt, I think that is very key going forward. The Sahel is a region, indeed. That is why in this project I presented, there is a regional approach. The advocacy, for instance, it is a regional advocacy. It is not only national advocacy, because when you take early marriage, it is from Mauritania to northern of Nigeria, it goes to Ethiopia. So when you want to address that, we need to look in that region. What are the commonalities between those countries that you can take on board when you want to address? If you take FGM, which is part of that, because people, they move from one. So if you enforce this side of the border, people, they move, they cross the border, and they bring their children to the other side, and they continue those practices. So we do agree with you. Adopting a regional approach, regional responses, regional strategy is very important. And we have learned also from the Ebola that surveillance, you cannot do the surveillance in one country. You have to do the surveillance across countries. I think that is very important. I don't really think that because you find some right wing in the US fighting sexual reproductive rights, that you need to stop fighting for that as a basic human right. Expanding the choices is key. And that is statisticians, you look at the numbers. So women have to be provided with that choice. Now, how it is enforced, as a United Nations Population Fund, we work for the choices of the people. As UN, we want to promote the human rights. So that is fundamental. Now, how it is being enforced from one country to another, that is another issue. But as a development partner, it doesn't prevent me to continue fighting for empowering girls and women through education, through financial autonomy, to have that choice.
Thank you, Benoit. Roger Mark.
So thank you very much. Great question. So a few quick points. I think to get to your question on public statements, I think it's a very good and valid point. For me, it's a question of who is the target audience and how do you message those public statements. So in the formulation of your question, you specifically talk about population growth. I do think you need to deconstruct that a little bit further. That is a little bit too facile for me, so forgive me. I do think you need to get to more nuanced messaging on the issues. And it's very interesting, some of the polling that we have seen on how you develop messages around these issues. Of course, you first take into account your target audience. If you're trying to get folks in the food security sector or conservation sector to think about these issues, what we have found is you can get them to think about family planning, but the point of entry is not necessarily family planning. They tend to be more receptive to messages on women's empowerment. And you can get to family planning, but you have to figure out how you do that. So I think it's a good point. There needs to be better messaging on this. It needs to be very nuanced and sophisticated. You have to determine who are your primary and secondary audiences and what messages best resonate with them and to what end. So I just wanted to add a little bit of that context. I think a really, really good question on the Sahel. Is it a region? I think we've talked a little bit about this. What I would add is I think there's a commonality of the challenges that the country countries face that unite them. And this is tied a little bit to the geographic factors that define them, and looking at issues like drought, these chronic conditions that they face. I do think they face them as a region, and having a regional strategy will enable them to better address them. It doesn't mean that you miss the nuances at a country or at a subnational level. I think you have to take that into account. But I think in other instances, in other platforms, it is useful to have a regional frame. And I think those of us who look at this from a climate change perspective or food security perspective see that it can be beneficial at times to have that framing. Really good reminder of education. Thank you for raising it. Just a couple of weeks ago, we were having a similar discussion, and even though she's not directly from the countries that we're talking about, with the Minister of Gender from Liberia at an event that the Aspen Institute convened. And we specifically spoke about this question, and it ties into the questions that we heard earlier about cultural and socioeconomic questions. And she said, in order to advance women's and girls' education in Liberia, she discovered as minister that one of the significant points of intervention for her was to invest in boarding schools for girls, sort of put them in a situation where they really cannot be pulled. These young girls cannot be pulled in other directions. So I think it's an interesting model. I don't know for the Sahel how successful that could be, but it is good to see that is one approach that we should be thinking about. And to get to the question on urban centers, I think those of us who look at this from a resilience frame and a climate change frame have been looking more closely in a more focused way on how urbanization is sometimes considered a climate change adaptation strategy. So there's that framing. I know your question was around trafficking, but I think underlying your question is, when there's increasing urbanization, does that accentuate fragilities and vulnerabilities? And those of us who look at urbanization from a resilience framing have some serious questions about this. So we look at our colleagues at UNFPA and elsewhere who have put forth some interesting analyses about urbanization as a climate change adaptation strategy. At the same time, those of us who are in the resilience community look at urbanization and an urbanizing continent and raise questions about early warning systems, network formation, increasing fragility, household formation, mobility, people moving in and out in an urban setting. And we say that when we look at when shocks occur, the degree to which we're able to mobilize populations in an urban setting. So your question raises a broader implication of looking at building resilience in an increasingly urbanizing Sahel and how we address that from a policy perspective. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Roger Mark. Sylvia?
Regarding messaging and making bold or bolder statements, I agree with Roger Mark's comment that we really need to consider the audience. Certainly I wouldn't be saying the same things here as I would to my parents who are in the Philippines, retired, watching Fox News. So the messaging is very important. That said, I also feel that both in our programmatic commitments and also in our agency-wide priorities, we've been very good about articulating these particular concerns. I definitely want to highlight our Feed the Future strategies and also our resilience policies as examples of programmatic commitments. And as an agency, we have a full suite of policies related to gender, not only our gender equity and women's empowerment policy, but also policies on gender-based violence and women, peace, and security, amongst other topics. And we also work closely with our colleagues at State to make sure that we do transmit the right message. In terms of education, I think we've all been pretty unequivocal about the importance, but I also feel like we all need to expand our definition of education as to build upon what Mr. Benoit said. we can't just think of it as equivalent to school. One of my favorite Feed the Future projects is in Mali, where we are training adolescent boys and girls, young men and young women who are out of school, both in life skills curriculum and in technical ag curriculum, so that they can grow value chains that are part of Feed the Future. So that's the kind of holistic approach that we want to take. In terms of the Sahel as a regional unit, we see a lot of cross-border trade and mobility of ethnic groups and certainly common languages. We focus specifically on Mali, Niger, and Burkina because of those commonalities and the ability to leverage those lessons learned across different countries. In terms of what's happening in the U.S. about reproductive health, yes. It is quite a quandary, but I'm also glad that we have this space for such intense debate. And certainly, within AID and within our partners, we have a wide variety of opinions. I worked for 7 years overseas with Catholic Relief Services, so you can imagine what their stance on family planning was. And yet we were also able to accomplish a lot in HIV AIDS education and reproductive health. And lastly, Morocco's influence. My husband is Moroccan. He's from Ouarzazate, which was the starting point of the salt trade that ended in Timbuktu. And so those historical and geographic ties go back centuries. And there's certainly right now a lot of commercial ties that we could build upon. One of the few international airlines that fly into these countries is Royal Air Morocco. And when we lived in Burkina and Mali, the host governments of Mali and Burkina actually had agreements with the Kingdom of Morocco, so that Ministry of Agriculture technicians from Morocco came to Burkina and Mali for a period of 1 to 2 years to provide technical assistance to their counterparts in agriculture. And that's, of course, in addition to, I'm sure, what the extensive security arrangements are within the region. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope to get at least a couple of rounds before we break. So the gentleman on my left side, the one at the back, you and the gentleman in the middle. Let's take those 4. You are number 3, then the middle.
Hello, my name is Lemi Mustak. I'm from Algeria, and I'm a PhD candidate I'm doing my PhD on Sahel region. And my question is related to, I have multi questions, but I will ask only 2. The one, it's related to how comes this region, like Sahel region, we know it's rich with natural resource, and they are poor. Do you think that's what's the role? Who run those countries? Is there government or the multinational, or I don't know, because in my country now it's happened in Ain Saleh. I don't know if you heard about. There is more than 5 months strike about shield gas in the south of Algeria, and no one heard about it. No one did nothing for it. And my second question is related to our neighbor, like Morocco. Do you think that the first thing that they should do toward the Sahel region is to give independence to West Saharan? Thank you.
No. She's not part of our discussion.
So this really is precisely to Ms. Van Min. A lot of interesting things many people said, but I wondered if you could disaggregate your experience in Senegal, both in terms of region, because some regions have a great deal more in common with the rest of the Sahel, and in terms of working with the migrants, many of whom come from the Sahel.
Hi, thank you for all your comments. They've been great. My name is Jamie Montgomery. I'm with USAID. I'm a climate advisor, so like my colleague, I'll be showing my bias as well. You know, a lot of the discussion around livelihood diversification tends to focus on agricultural livelihoods. And while climate smart agriculture is definitely important and goes a long way to making those livelihoods less sensitive to climate-related impacts, it doesn't reduce it to zero. And so I'm curious to what extent you've seen good examples in the Sahel region of where folks have been engaged in non-climate or non-agricultural related livelihood diversification. So those livelihoods that would be, you know, essentially not sensitive to climate-related changes, or if you had thoughts on where there might be opportunities to kind of broaden engagement on these issues.
Thank you. My name is Mike McGahee. I'm retired USAID, USDA. And I was with the Natural Resource Management and did a lot of work with agriculture, so I also have biases. First of all, thank you very much for your presentations. It was very educational for me. You did a lot to articulate the problems and the challenges faced by a lot of Sahelians with respect to climate and food security. One thing I didn't hear were some of the responses of the Sahelians, some of the progress that has been achieved in addressing those problems. And I think that, and these are pretty well documented in terms of the regreening going on across the Sahel, in terms of water harvesting, hundreds of thousands of hectares, on-farm forestry. It's not the end, it's not the final solution to their problems, but it is a foundation. And I think that if you had looked at that, you probably would have supported, been able to find support, empirical support, for many of the principles that you so well articulated today, like property rights and tenure, women's rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me recap the questions for the panelists. The first question by Mahmoud, I hope I get your name correct, is about the role of resources and how that relates to development and also to the issue of the panel, resilience. The second one about Morocco independence towards Sahara, I didn't feel like that was part of the panel, but feel free to talk about it, especially people from the region. Then the second, I didn't get your name, sorry, but you wanted specific disaggregation of regional experience in the Sahel, in Senegal. So that's for Benoit. Then Jamie would like to have comments on good examples of non-agricultural related activities that build resilience. And then the last question by Mike is more of a comment because it's about talking about solutions, and I feel the panel was really setting the pace to other ones that are coming after this, which will go deeper into some of the solutions that are happening. But I think this was really framing the issues in terms of what are the challenges and kind of some of the highlights. But I'm hoping as well that we'll get to see what are some of the activities that are happening. But feel free, each of the panelists, please feel free to talk about that. So let's start from Mike, if you want to comment on anything, and then come this way.
I'll stick to the Senegal question. Per region, yes, Senegal, obviously, the regions are very different. Some of the regions we saw, I would say, a slower, maybe a little bit slower uptake of family planning, especially the region of Diourbel, which is where the most religious town of Senegal is located, Touba. But even there, uptake is high and still small because it's only one team working the whole region. But the uptake has definitely happened across all the regions of Senegal. The biggest obstacles to uptake of family planning actually has been the belief, and again, going back to maybe my points earlier, is the belief that it was possible in the regions. And there's one particular region, the region of Matam, where the médecin chef was like, no, can't work in Matam, which is very interesting because with UNFPA, actually, we provided a week-long different caravan of providing family planning, and we got 350 women in 1 week to take up family planning. That's enormous. So I think it's possible in every region. I think that those lessons learned from different regions, and especially also from regions in Mali, where similar teams operate in Gao and Timbuktu, and are seeing that if you get close to the woman, you can provide these services. And I hope, to the gentleman who I now can't see anymore, that actually also talks to some of the solutions, that it is possible to bring it back down to the level, to the smaller level, to not get overwhelmed by the bigger picture.
Thank you. Benoit?
I think, Mark, your invitation to LIM is working, because I can see that in this last batch of questions, there is a lot of internalization and modification. So that is very good. I will link the question from our colleague from Algeria with the one on Morocco. I think beyond the Sahel, we need to look at also the northern part. Not only for the security reason, we know how the movement of people there, but if you saw one of my slides on the migration, was showing that while maybe up to the 90s, the movement was from the Sahel belt to the coast. Now we have a reverse movement, people coming back to the original region, but now moving to the northern part. I think that needs to be somehow addressed regionally and between countries. And being rich and people are poor, that is the whole, I think, hypothesis of development. And in the demographic dividend framework, you have many wheels that need to be turning at the same time. Health has to be addressed, education has to be addressed, employment has to be addressed, financial policy has to be addressed, governance has to be addressed. Unless those many wheels are turning together, then you have the dividend coming out as an outcome. So that is the way we need to be looking at that. That is why the integrated strategy that addresses peace and security, governance, and all the resilience components have to be taken as a package. And the multi-sectorial integration, that makes all the sense to that. I think that's the way that the few modification or energization that I can bring to that series of questions. I think disaggregation is very important. I think as we move to universality, we need to break the inequality where we see that most of the services are urban concentrated, maybe addressing more rural. Even we think about urbanization today, vulnerability is more still in rural areas. So, and the behavior are not the same. Information is not the same. So that disaggregation is very key to have relevant solutions and responses to development challenges.
Thank you, Benoit. Roger Mark?
These are really good. I agree. I feel now we're really liming. It's a really good set of questions, and I don't know that I know the answers. I agree with the point about looking at initiatives around regreening, water harvesting, sort of looking at those sectors and seeing what has been beneficial there. Your question, Jamie, on non-agricultural livelihood diversification is a really good one. So many of the examples that I'm familiar with or I've worked with colleagues on around education, nutrition, microcredit, is all tied to the agricultural sector. So you've posed some homework for me now, but I'm really glad that you asked it. I don't know the answer, and I'd like to find out more. So I thought that was a really good question. The question on resources and sort of the management of the resources, there continues to be inequity, questions around distribution, questions around lack of community engagement, and questions around conflict. Conflict is a conflict around resources in the region continues to be an important dimension that those of us who look at this from a peace-building angle continue to focus on. So I don't know if it's always in areas that are rich in resources. Sometimes there's scarce resources, and there's conflict over that, and how those resources are captured by political elites, and what does that mean for the poorest households? So those are some of the questions that I think that raises for me.
Thank you.
I concur that it's really difficult to think of non-ag livelihood examples, maybe because I am in the Bureau of Food Security. But I did come up with a few. When I was in Burkina Faso in February, we visited an association of rural women, and it was very interesting to see them because one of their activities was a hospitality training center for youth. And part of that training center was a restaurant, and that was their primary income generating activity. So the young people were being trained to be chefs and servers, and they were actually practicing by serving real customers, and they focused on local varieties of food and local dishes. Our friends who work in mobile technology, I think, have done a lot in terms of non-traditional livelihoods. I remember going to one brown bag where they talked about setting up call centers in Iraq that were staffed primarily by women, because many of their women clients felt more comfortable calling another woman if they had problems with their billing or wanting to know about the different packages for their cell phones. And then lastly, I recently, or last year, I did a TDY in South Africa on cross-border trade. And in Southern Africa, over 70% of the informal traders are women. And not only do they trade in foodstuff, but also in textiles and household goods. So that's really a potential, extremely underserved market.
Thank you, Sylvia. I'm hoping we can sneak the last round of questions. Do we have some remaining unanswered questions? Good. So because it looks like we have 4 minutes, I wanted to use the prerogative to maybe hear from across the panelists. We talked about, in one of the presentations, we talked about financing and funding, and it's something that I was hoping it could come out more strongly at this panel, or maybe in later panels. Roger Mark presented a slide which had about trying to look at the magnitude of the problem, but also the resource overlay, which was around $1.9 billion US to be able to meet some of the challenges. I would be interested to hear some of the exciting work around mobilizing funding or financial support, either from national governments, bilateral and multilaterals. Of course, we've talked about some of the initiatives, but this could be even open to the audience. What needs to happen to ensure that there's sustained financial commitment for helping move us into a real progress in the Sahel? Yeah. Do we feel like we are close to the 1.9 billion? Is that a number that the development community rallies around? I mean, how is the need versus the resource envelope available? And of course, if we don't have any comments, we could break and hope the issue will come up in one of the later sessions. But there's a gentleman who has his hand up.
Before we get to his question, I would say from a humanitarian perspective that the humanitarian relief community usually sees a shortfall of about 40% of what they estimate. That's rough across the region. When they disaggregate that by countries, it varies. But on average, they are saying in terms of what's needed to provide the level of humanitarian responses, they're getting about 60% of what's needed. So that there is a shortfall, and they are thinking about what are the primary interventions that they can focus on that responds to immediate crises, but also helps build a base that provides a no regrets humanitarian response. So how do you come in and provide a response that's providing longer term mechanisms that help build a base that makes the communities even more resilient, so that the communities are able to mobilize themselves and be first responders when these crises occur. But
let's get there.
Thank you. I just want. My name is Michael Boyce. I'm with Refugees International. We're a humanitarian advocacy group, and I just wanted to reinforce a bit what Roger Mark said, which I think is extremely relevant. These days the humanitarian community globally is facing enormous shortfalls, and I think the fact is that those shortfalls now are being felt probably disproportionately by humanitarian operations in Africa, in regions like the Sahel, where not only are we seeing shortfalls, as Roger Mark alluded to, in the making the humanitarian to development transition, longer term funding to build the resilience of host communities as well as displaced people, but I think we're also starting to see troubling erosions in just meeting emergency needs of refugees and displaced people. Basic things like life-saving food assistance, which I think of for example, the Sudanese refugee population in Chad have been on half rations for more than a year now, in one of the most hostile environments that we can think about. So, as Roger Mark alluded to, I think we do need to see some development actors, particularly the World Bank and other financial institutions, take the burden off the humanitarian system and better help some of these longer-term displaced populations meet their own needs. Because if we don't do that, the shortfalls on the life-saving side are going to get greater and greater, and we're going to see increased mortality and suffering as a result.
Thank you for those remarks. Benoit, did you want to say a final comment before we wrap up?
Final, but just a personal reflection. What is happening now, there is a global conversation on financing for development when it comes to sustainable development goals. And of course, that is tying together humanitarian development. What is coming out right now is the Sahel region has been very dependent from donors, external, and the ODA. But the developed world now is saying you need to start tapping on your own internal resources. You are potentially rich or you are rich. What are you doing with your own resources? I think that is something that we need to bear in mind as we go to the July meeting in Addis Ababa, how that dynamic is going to evolve. But for me, having worked for more than 20 years in the region, I see that there is a lot of responsibility locally where some of our areas of work, when it's come to education, when it's come to health, I think the individual, community, national responsibility and accountability has to be taken into account. And there are domestic resources that need to be invested to maintain the sustainability of and the success of those interventions.
Thank you very much, Benoit. I feel it has been an excellent almost 2 hours where the panelists have been able to take us down a road of looking at an overview of the population dynamics in the Sahel, with some focus on issues to do with climate change, population and resilience. We saw how look at some of the disconnect between existing policies and programs, and not even that, more looking at how reposition population dynamics and family planning can be done within the resilience programs. We also had a good deal of gender issues and our social norms, in addition to demographics, have been part of the gender coping mechanisms and how those have been addressed in some of the regions. But we also had a presentation on the need to demystify family planning and how family planning should be central and key to the efforts in resilience. And what I got overall in this panel is that ensuring access to voluntary family planning and reproductive health, while investing in such other important aspects such as education, economic empowerment, are important not only for women's health and economic opportunities, but they can also help individuals, communities, and families to adapt to shocks, including climate change, but also help them make them more resilient to the economic, social, and environmental shocks. So with all that, I would like you to join me in applauding today's panelists. I feel that we did a good job learning, internalizing, modifying, and energizing for the next sessions. Thank you very much, and looking forward to more of the discussion in the later sessions. Thank you.
Thank you.